their schedules are so tight, they have no other choice.
But it is, or you can divide up those groups. If those kind of groups become little clumps that disrupt class, you can also divide them up and give them a chance to make friends with other people. And they do, they have each other's contact information, so if they ever have questions, they can also contact each other. They can use each other as an outlet, so I'm a huge fan of small group work, and it's more than an experiment, it works throughout your careers. So.
Even at the graduate level, I had a seminar last semester that I actually, where they did that exact thing you described. There was like 3 or 4 person teams in a rather large graduate seminar, and every week you were working on projects with those people. And I popped out of this conference actually to have lunch with my 2 former teammates, because like we want to remain friends because we were from different programs after that. So that's, I think I've had very positive experience with that. Also, one thing I do is like just you arbitrarily divide the class in half and assign them, they have to make an argumentative debate on a position.
Yep.
And it basically forces them, particularly with first years, to basically get, start talking to each other and not just be in a passive listening situation. Because if you keep them in the usual, it's the same 5 people in a class of 20 answering all the questions every time.
I was just going to say, I just want to go back to your idea of like the very first day, like of class, what to do, and I think this ties back to the classroom justice power. One thing I do that I think is pretty effective, and it gives up power a little bit, is we always set the class up. Here's what I expect of you. You have to do all these things. And I kind of turn the table, and I allow them to tell me what they expect of me. So I've given you all these different ideas, now what do you expect of me? And I usually require a couple students to write them down, and we create like a Blackboard spot where then those are all there. And they come up with very interesting things, like, if I write you an email, I really want you to respond to me. And some of them are like, could you call me by my first name? Or I want to be called a certain name. That's really important to me. And they tell you those kind of things. I think that is an important moment. The other part of the very first day that for me is important is that first day of class indicates how the rest of the semester is going to go. So if you're going to be a lecturer, then you should be lecturing. If you're going to be a discussion-based instructor, you should be leading discussion. And I think that sets the tone in how the rest of the class is going to go. If you expect civility in the classroom, it should be civil on the first day. Those are the kind of things. I think the very first day is integral. That's kind of what the classroom research said. The first day is not going so hot, and you got a lot of work to do to kind of pull it up. So I think a lot of times we go the very first day and we're like, let's see how it goes. But that's not, that's not a good sound approach.
And actually, it's a cynical concern with numbers too, because quite frankly, in major required classes that they had to take for the major, I kind of made a point to look like a real badass so that I could get non-serious people who wanted A's and wanted to get into law school out of my goddamn class. And basically, this semester, it was just a first-year seminar that was optional to fulfill the GE requirement, but they didn't have to take it, and I did the same performance, and I had about a third of my class drop. Because basically they were freshmen who wanted A's, and I told them it's not happening, probably, except for 4 or 5 weeks. And we were worried for a hot second until it's me and 2 other instructors, worried for a hot second until the wait list pumped it back up, like whether the seminar was going to make. So I think you also have to be very sensitive as to whether it's a required class where you have some liberty like that, or whether it's an optional.
I think too, to address your point about reticent students, the thing that I found most successful is to make yourself available to them in a way that works for them. One thing that I've started to do is I'll Skype with my athletes when they can't come to my office hours or when they're out of town. So I'll be in my office, but I'll Skype with them because their coaches have their iPads with them on the bus, right? And so we'll just talk about their assignment. Or some students are very nervous about meeting you in your office. That's a very panic-inducing moment for them. So one thing I know Jen does, and I've done before too, is like, hey, I'm going to be at the coffee shop on the street. That's where I'm going to do my office hours today. And so making yourself available to them in a way that works best for them. And I know we're all reticent about responding to 8 emails at a time or giving students our phone numbers. But if that's what's going to get them to connect and to get them to stay on board, I've become much more okay with that because if that's what works for them, I want it to work.
I know quite a few of us have like the Google
Voice.
A lot of us have the Google Voice. Like my students text me, they call me, and I've never had a problem with it. If there's, it's always a very drastic situation, like my car broke down. And it's usually the students that are getting an A in your class and they've never missed class that are like, oh my God, I'm going to miss this one day. And I'm like, fine, like, no big deal. But I do think, like, the Google Voice is really an awesome resource, and I have
Everyone know what
found.
that is?
No,
Oh, yeah.
You can set up your phone number to be routed through Google, so you can give students a Google Voice phone number.
It's not your own.
It's not your own, but it calls your phone.
Yeah, it calls your phone. So they have kind of like a, I don't know what
so
you
it's,
want to call it.
it's a proxy.
Right. It's a
Yeah,
proxy
proxy
phone number, yeah.
And I found a lot of students will text me and just be like, and very like professional, I mean, we had a conversation about professional communication. They'll be like, hey Stevie, I'm having a problem, I can't find this page in the workbook or something. And I'm like, okay, text me back. And a lot of those students are the students that would not come to my office hours, might email me, or would be more willing to maybe talk to me after class, but that's a really awkward moment for them. So I find that to be useful. And then I'm also not filtering a lot of emails.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a way to reduce that.
Well, I can bounce off that real quick. I'm in the marching band here at UNC, and our director sends his email, and he sends the contact us through email, encourages us to email, and he also has his personal cell phone number attached to every single one of his emails. So if you have a really quick question about, okay, do we actually need to have white shoes for band practice, where he will respond almost immediately.
Yeah.
He's really good about contacting us. And then I also had a point of like small group, like personal experience in small groups. I have a friend who is actually working with international students, and it's actually through a church organization, so it's not based in the classroom, but they end up being like one-on-one and having to go someplace like each week and having conversations. And
Yeah.
she was just telling me that this past weekend with Easter, she had her international student ask her what the heck the Easter Bunny was, because they didn't even know what that was. I know that's something that I've experienced personally. If I'm in the smaller group, maybe like 2 or 3 people, because like once you get above that, it's kind of easy to just like drift and kind of like, okay, you guys can do the work, but it's really easy with a smaller group to just mesh and just feel comfortable talking to one another, because you get to know each other a little bit better. And that's something that I experienced when I was actually learning how to play an instrument. I showed up at the band camp the first day, didn't know how to play. One person who was willing to talk to me about it.
Yeah.
That was really helpful.
I want to bounce off the reticence in the even athletes. My athletes are good now. I mean, they were always good. It was me that wasn't teaching to them, I guess, for some, some of them. But what I've found is that now I meet them where they are. Athletes are competitive, so we play Jeopardy as a review every time. They love that. I told them we weren't going to review before the next quiz, and they were upset about that. And also, the first day of class, I figure out who's what position and what sports they play, because those sports mean a lot to them. So when I know who's playing a game and tell them good luck or whatever, or they're not in class, I give them alternative assignments. But also, when they're talking in class, if you know who the quarterback is and you know who has power in that situation, then if they're picking on someone else on the team, then I just say, hey, keep that in the locker room. Or, this is class, it's not, your team. So, because some people have more power over others in that situation, and they might actually tease them too much to the point where it becomes to be uncomfortable for that other player. So I think I have to meet the teams where they are, and that's one thing I've incorporated to help them.
We have about 10 minutes left, and one of the last things I wanted to leave with was a discussion that I've kind of heard brought up a little bit. Jessica brought it up about subjectivity. Stevie mentioned a little bit about invisibility, and when we talked about grouping, I was curious how do we engage these ideas of invisible differences? So many times, like the first generation, or maybe LGBTQ issues, these differences that aren't on our sleeve, if you will.
Learning disabilities.
Yes, disabilities, yeah.
I'm a big advocate that, you don't have to live up to the label. The label doesn't give you power, the labeler has the power in that situation. So even if I know those students are first generation college students, because the university tells us, I treat them just like students, right? Categories are permeable, they leak over. We have multifaceted identities, and so the way we enact our identity in one context, that may just be one small, minute part of who we are. And that's how I try to engage all of my students. And I try to treat them as individuals, right? Not part of a collective identity or group. They may be first-generation college students, they may be Hispanic students from inner city Chicago, they may be Black students from the Caribbean. But they're all students in my class and they're all in Com 1030, and we're going to talk about public speaking in a civil way, and we're probably going to talk about some controversial topics. And we're going to treat each other with a humanist perspective. We might disagree with each other, but we're going to disagree with the idea, not with the individual. And so that's a big, for me, it's a big philosophy that I engage my class with. And I think if you as the instructor set the tone, I found that my students live up to that. They kind of move up with me. And you'll have some that struggle and they'll kind of flounder a little bit, but you gotta kind of just keep reminding them. And for me, that's an effective approach.
Earlier, Stevie said get to know your students, and I think that that has to be one of the most important things, right? If you understand who your students are and where you're coming from, it's easy to see the warning signs when things are not going well. And it's easy then to help, it's easier to talk to them about the situation and to really deal with that. I think one thing, Steve and I were talking about this earlier, that is a reality of the university now that is an invisible difference is veterans. We have a very rapidly increasing veteran population in our classroom, and this was a situation that really affected me personally last semester a lot. And knowing the resources that are available to your students in different student groups on campus is really, really helpful in those situations, right? So when I had a veteran that came to me with an issue and was clearly dealing with some very intense PTSD, I was able to give her resources on campus, and Stevie's had a couple of examples that are really powerful, but having those resources and getting to know your students is one of the best ways to deal with those invisible differences, because then you can support them without spotlighting them, and you can give them necessary comforts and help that they need without calling attention to the fact that they've got this difference.
Also, just getting to know your dean of students
Oh,
office and
yes.
what they can do,
Yes.
because they can be in places you can't. Is a huge. As soon as you see something
Yeah.
that is potentially a problem, you need to get in contact with those
Yeah,
students.
and being aware of the broader university community, I think, is an important part of that. We've had a couple of suicides on campus in the past year, and we've had some issues that were campus-wide, and so knowing that our freshman students especially were dealing with some of those issues and talking about them in the classroom, I think, has been really helpful for a lot of us.
I guess I would just add non-essentializing students, that I think a good example would be a student in my class who people would presume is white, told the class, I'm half African American, So you can't presume to know about students even when you see visible signs, so I just try not to do that. When we talk about, you said, about targeting white males, I don't really look at it that way. I just look at it if we're exploring something they haven't explored before. I'm not really targeting anyone. The article is by a white woman who's exploring her own race. So I guess just not essentializing people.
One of the things that I try to do, and this is maybe really well situated in the public speaking classroom, is I teach about intersectionality on the audience analysis day, because I think a lot of times what happens is we compartmentalize people into different groups, and so you've got this identity, this identity, this identity, and we separate them. And so I title that discussion When Categories Collide, right? And so I'll get to drawing things on the board and everything, because I think once you start to combine some of those categories, it's like, well, now we have identities that we don't talk about, because unless you're like a dead white male, like those are the only categories that a lot of times I think we tend to lump together and talk about. And so what I do is I mention, it's like, so if you were to approach this particular issue or example from a woman's perspective, you might assume that this person's going to think this way, but what happens when you're talking about a female Republican or a female Democrat or a female of color, right? And so then you start to combine all these things and poof, we have an identity that we've never really talked about before, right? And so I think a lot of times that is really, it's enlightening to a certain extent, especially for like first or second year students who maybe don't have a lot of experience with that, but it also gets them thinking about the ways in which all of these different positions combine in ways that we maybe didn't think about. And so it's like, oh, I also have this unique and very confusing identity, just like everybody else does. And so I think that gets them thinking more critically about what different people might look like.
Well, and I think especially when you talk about choice and being able to have the students engage and participate in some of the content that's available through the class, I like to, I mean, everyone has little short video clips that you'll show that kind of exemplify a theory or a concept. I also like to get the students to send those out to the entire class, and we'll put them at the beginning of class, or I'll insert them into class. And then you also get an opportunity to kind of have some content that's relevant to particular students that can then also strike up a conversation or be relevant in other ways to then also talk about things like what is it like to be a first generation college student, or other differences that we don't necessarily think of or that usually come up in some class conversation.
Anyone have anything else? Yeah, please.
Well, I really like a lot of the ideas, and I think letting the students lead and tell you where they're coming from, and I think the group work is really important. I've had a problem sometimes in action teams or small groups where sometimes a kind of a group thing can happen, where an opinion leader in that group could be kind of not the person you want in charge of that group. So I do a thing where they rotate pairs, and in workshopping and in conversation with each other, and everybody has to get to know like every other person in kind of a detailed way, and I think that humanizes people a lot. But this other thing about letting students lead, I have some good experiences like that, where a student in my gender communication class, a young white man, he says to me, "Dr. Cloud, I'm really sorry, but I just think gay people aren't normal." And I'm in the class, and I don't know what he knows about me yet or not, because I come out kind of gradually and naturally, like my partner and I were watching this and she said blah, 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 you know what I mean? But there were other gay students in the class, lesbian students, right? And so I'm like, how do I deal with this? And so I thought a minute and I said, "Doug, what do you mean by normal?" You know, and just trying to understand what they mean, because sometimes they say things and you think, oh, they mean something really horrible, but he said, well, he said, "I think that I've never really met a gay person before. Like, this is not normal in my experience." Right?
Which is very different.
Yeah. I said, so we could talk about like statistical norm, in which case gay people are not normal, right? That's true. There is a sense in which what you said, that you have never encountered a gay person before, that you know of. And then there's the deviant part, or wrong, or somehow morally. And I said, we have to distinguish among those types, and I have to tell you that for me, that last one is kind of not okay, because if you're gonna have people in your audience, you know, but I really appreciate that you were willing to talk to me about that. And then everybody was like totally cool, you know, but it's a matter of letting them, but then what about when you have a student and you really want them to tell you what they mean, but they're afraid, or they can't, or they don't have the language to do that, or they're actually at risk. Like, what about when students are gonna hurt each other, either verbally or even beyond that, right? So putting the burden on them in that situation is kind of hard, and I have to figure out where to draw that line and intervene in the situation, but mostly I try not to, you know, I try until, I mean, I really think that something extreme or even a little hurtful is gonna get out.
Well, and I think if you're framing those discussions from the beginning, there's a lot of norming that happens amongst students in your classrooms. In a class I taught last semester, this happened. And it took me by surprise. A student made another comment to a female student that was very sexist and was very problematic. But instantly, two of the other males in the class said, "You can't say that. That is not okay. Like, we would like you to apologize." And so I was just sitting there going like, this is so, oh my God. And so we ended up having a conversation though, because like Steve was saying on day one, we frame the expectations of this class that this will be a respectful interaction, and that this will happen, and so they start to take accountability of those norming procedures and start to really correct one another.
I had a really powerful moment kind of like that at Illinois State University, where in one of my first generation classes, there were, including myself, there were 3 white students, and the rest of the students were either Hispanic or African American. And there was, we were doing a claim data warrant activity, and I was looking for a claim, and they were like, "Beyonce's pregnant." And one of the black students in class was like, "Oh, she doesn't know who that is." and, because she's white, and they were referencing me.
Uh-huh.
And then another black student was like, you can't say that to her, that's racist. And they kind of normed themselves to protect me, which was interesting. And I saw them do that for themselves, either in realizing that black, there's a lot of degrees of what black means. And they realized that just because they were black, they weren't all the same, right? We all weren't from the same, even same state, same city, same country. So that was a very interesting experience, because in the moment I was like, how am I gonna handle this? And then one of the students, he was just like, you can't say that. And they kind of self-corrected. So I think those moments are very challenging. Like, I reflect on that often. I'm like, if he hadn't said something, how would I have engaged that conversation in a way that was a learning opportunity for them in the future also?
I would have sung some Beyonce lyrics.
Yeah, that's generally my approach.
I wanted to be like, you think I'm that boring? Like, that I don't know who Beyonce is?
That's a real insult, right?
Yeah. But I think those moments are, not just reprimanding, but actually making it a learning opportunity. How can we spin that moment that's challenging, that's difficult, that we feel the tension, into a learning opportunity for them to self-correct? And those are tough moments, and especially when we deal with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, geographical displacement, and the list goes on. How do we not other students in class that we don't know their identity? And then other, maybe potentially ourselves, against students who feel connected to us, or they feel like we're going to protect them. I think it's a very tough moment.
Well, please join me in thanking